Hey everyone, it's Patch 3.22 Ancestor, and I want to continue our Impending Doom series by telling you how to take your League Start Impending Doom and how to take this League Start Impending Doom path of building and convert it over to a mid-game path of building and a mid-game build. This is going to go over basically every single bit of information that you need in terms of upgrading your Impending Doom character and to keep you up to knowledge on everything that is relevant for the build and how most of the mechanics for this build are going to work. The notes section for this build before we start is super extensive. I have put the most amount of effort I have ever put into any build guide into this note section, and I please implore you to read it if you have any questions. And if you want to touch up on anything that we talked about in this video, it will all be here in text format for you to look at later. Please, please, please look at this and please, please, please take your time with it, as basically any question that you have will be answered by this. I've kind of foxed this build in terms of I've created a mini wiki for Impending Doom in the notes section. By all means, this is nowhere close to the amount of effort Fox puts into his guides, but I have tried to take some inspiration from it and to basically write everything that you need to know about in words, just so you can have a very easy one-stop place to answer any of your questions on it. Let's move on and let's start talking about everything we need to keep in mind. So the first thing I want to talk about in all of this is going to be some very important mechanics on how our build is going to work. The first thing I want to talk about and mention is the way cooldown recovery rate and cast speed work in this build. So Impending Doom is a very special skill that works different from other trigger skills. The main thing to talk about here is that Impending Doom actually has charges. And because of that, we don't need to adhere to very strict server ticks in terms of the cooldown recovery rate that we get for this build. The charges can actually recharge between server ticks, meaning that 1% cooldown recovery rate will actually give you 1% faster Doom Blasts, meaning we have a linear scaling, which makes every 1% of cooldown recovery rate actually give us 1% more damage effectively. Now, there is a point where we actually will care about this and the cooldown recovery rate will be important. Flashbang warning here. And that is at over 80% cooldown recovery rate, simply because at this point, the numbers are going to be so small that we're going to have a few rounding problems, as it's only going to go to 3 decimal places. But the thing is, we don't actually care about this, as we will never be reaching 80% cooldown recovery rate. 80% is only possible if you are playing this build as a shadow and if you're running the like Clockwork Ascendancy for 30% more cooldown recovery rate. Otherwise, that is completely irrelevant. And the only thing I could tell you here is that for cooldown recovery rate, you simply just want to stack as much of it as you can, as all of it is effectively good. Now, the other thing to mention is how cast speed works. In the description below and in the notes section, I will have this spreadsheet linked. This is a spreadsheet that breaks down everything you need to know in terms of your cooldown recovery rate and your cast speed for this build. All you need to do is make a copy of it and then input your action speed in this box here. The action speed that you're going to have in this build is simply just going to be whatever is on your boots. If you don't have an Eldritch implicit on your boots for action speed, then you have no action speed to put in here and you just leave it at 0. The only number that we really need to care about is the cast speed. The cast speed for this build works in bands, meaning there is a minimum cast speed that you need to reach to be able to trigger everything at a optimal level. And there is a hard cast speed that if you pass over, you'll actually start losing damage and it'll make your build overall worse, and you need to reduce your cast speed. This will simply just output all the numbers at every single cooldown recovery rate breakpoint. And all you have to do to be able to make sure that you are doing everything correctly is to simply just import your path of building, your own builds, into path of building. Go to the calc section, select your main 6 link from the socket group, select the curse itself in the active skill. Don't pick Doom Blast. We want to look at the actual curse. And then look at the increased cast speed that you see in the orange box. You then just simply have to take this number and then you just have to go compare it to the spreadsheet for whatever given cooldown recovery rate breakpoint you're currently at. And as long as you are not in the red, you are good to go and you don't have to worry about anything else. This is very important, and I would really, really make sure that you are on your game for this, as making this be incorrect can lose you massive, massive amounts of damage. If you want an example of how bad this is, if I were to, for example, attempt to pick up 10% more cast speed for my build, as you can see, I lose 15% of my damage, which is really, really bad. We don't want to go overboard on cast speed, and we really want to make sure we are within the correct bands and not go over the hard limit. The next thing I want to talk about is the defensive layers for this build and how we're going to actually make our build immortal. This build is going to rely on one major defensive layer, and that is converting the majority of the physical damage we take into elemental damage, then putting all of our eggs into one basket and focusing every defensive layer on reducing all of the elemental damage we take by as much as possible. If we convert our physical damage over to elemental damage, that means that physical damage that we have taken can now benefit from things such as a ruby flask or a topaz flask, which make us take less damage of their respective element. The nice thing about these flasks as well is they benefit from flask effect. So if we had 100% increased flask effect, this topaz flask would go from 20% less lightning damage taken to 40% less lightning damage taken, making this a very powerful defensive layer just in general. The other thing to mention is armor. Now this build is going to have a pretty hard time to get armor, mostly because it's on the right side of the tree and there's basically no armor here. So if we want to get high physical damage reduction, we need to stack percent physical damage reduction, we need to stack endurance charges, and we need to stack a hell of a lot of armor. And that really just doesn't work out. Physical damage reduction is a very difficult stat to get by. Endurance charges are a little bit hard to consistently keep up. So our only real option is to just convert everything. We're going to be converting the majority of our physical damage to elemental damage through the use of a craft on a helmet, through a lightning coil for 50%, through a taste of hate for another 15%, and through a Watcher's Eye with a physical converted to cold while affected by purity of elements. Now this spot the building is only going to be about 85% converted, but that's going to be more than enough. And you aren't really going to need more than that, as us utilizing Bloodnotch will really take care of the rest of it. So let's start at the physical conversion portion first. Now, with us having 85% of it converted, that means whenever we take a hit, our armor is going to be substantially more effective against it. The way armor works is if you have a small amount of it, it's going to be absolutely garbage against big hits, and it's going to be extremely effective against really, really small hits. Now, if we are converting 85% of our physical damage over to elemental, that means that we're only taking 15% of the damage, and our armor isn't going to look at the pre-conversion number. It's going to look at the post-conversion number. So our armor is only going to need to work against 15% of the hits, and that's only going to get better the more conversion that we actually get. Meaning that even a tiny little bit of armor like this gives us 56% physical damage reduction. Now, this is going to be higher, and you are going to want to make this higher. But the reason it's only 1.3k is because the boots and the helmet in this have no prefixes. Ideally, when you're crafting these items, you're most likely going to get some sort of armor implicit on these, which is then going to make your armor, instead of going from 1.3k, to go to about 2k. And at 2k armor, your physical damage reduction against a small amount of physical damage you're actually going to take is going to be closer to 80, 85, and even 90%, depending on how much total armor you actually get. With us converting all of our physical over to elemental, as I mentioned, we can then use these flasks, but later on in the build, once we go into a super endgame setup, we can add in very fun things such as Eternal Damnation, which makes it so we get half of our chaos resistance as elemental damage reduction, meaning we'll get about 35% additional elemental damage reduction on top of our resistances, on top of the less damage taken from the flasks, and on top of Transcendence later on, which means that our physical damage reduction not only benefits from our resistances, not only benefits from flask, will now benefit from this as well, making it so whatever sort of physical damage we took in the first place is basically multiplied and multiplied and multiplied so far down that's going to be really tiny and basically insignificant, making us immune to effectively all physical damage except for absolutely massive hits. And even then, I don't think with an Eternal Damnation there will really be anything that will actually be able to one-shot you like that. But the thing is about Eternal Damnation, the reason it's on this path of building is because I think this is going to be a chase item in Sanctum. This item most likely will cost over 100 div, as I expect the rarity of this to just be absolutely deleted. And I expect this to be one of the rare items that you'll sometimes get in Sanctum, but we'll see what happens. But even if we don't have this, the fact that we can scale our flask effect and give us effectively just less damage to all damage types makes it really powerful to convert all of our damage now. The other thing that's going to help with all this is going to be Bloodnotch and Stun Tech. In the description below, I will be linking a video on this from the previous season that kind of goes into more detail on how this works and on some other applications of Bloodnotch. But the TLDR here is that Bloodnotch, and depending on the roll you get, you really want to get a higher roll, but Bloodnotch is going to take a portion of all the damage you take from a stunning hit and immediately recover it as life. So this means if we were to take 1,000 damage and 1,000 damage stunned us, Bloodnotch would immediately heal you for 500, meaning you just effectively DR'd that hit by half. The way we're going to make everything actually stun us is by abusing the fact that we have very low energy shield and that we're using the energy shield for Eldritch Battery. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up this energy shield mastery here, which makes it so our stun threshold is based on 60% of our energy shield instead of life. Now, typically this would be really good in low life and in ES-based builds, but in our case, we're using it because we want to get stunned more often. 60% of our 500 ES is effectively around 230 or so. So if we were to take a hit for 1,000, that hits, if it was to check against 250 effective life pool, basically gives it a guaranteed chance to stun us. This makes it so any hit that's anywhere bigger than I would say 400 to 500, which is going to be like 80% of hits you take, will be a guaranteed chance to stun you. Meaning Bloodnotch will immediately reduce it by half. And anything that doesn't stun you is probably such a small number that you didn't even notice your health slightly moving. So Bloodnotch is effective against every single little bit of actual relevant damage. Now, the thing is, you might be saying, Allie, how do we deal with consistently being stunned? Isn't that going to feel like garbage? Yes. Luckily, we can completely remedy that. So we're going to be also including in a immutable force. This gives us a hell of a lot of stun and block recovery, meaning that your stuns and your blocks will be so tiny you will not notice them and it will not impact your gameplay at all. The only time that you might notice them is while casting, because even a 0.0001 millisecond stun will still interrupt your cast. And for that, we're going to be running a Unwaveringly Evil on our Cluster Jewel, which makes it so while we're casting a Chaos skill, which our curses are Chaos skills, will be immune to stuns. Now, the stuns are still going to go through because this is Ignore Interruption, which is good for us because that means Bloodnotch will be effective. And at the same time, the stun will actually negatively impact us, making any of the stuns against us just completely be ignored and turning any sort of hit against us into just a massive extra defensive layer. Between Bloodnotch, between our Flasks, and between our conversion, we have a really solid amount of defenses, especially when you add in the 15,000 evasion rating that we're going to have, meaning that most attacks against us will just miss anyway, and the 100% spell suppression chance that we have, meaning that any sort of elemental damage you take is already going to be reduced by half. On top of all this, while not very relevant, is the 36% block chance. This isn't too much, but it's still a very nice defensive layer, especially when we have Immutable Force, making this actually pretty consistent. If that wasn't enough for you, this build is also going to have absolutely ridiculous recovery. If you see over here, we have 4.4k life, and we have 1,600 life recovery per second. That is permanent. What we're going to be abusing here is the Pathfinder Master Surgeon node. What this does is it makes it so our life flasks don't get removed off of us if we go to full health. And this makes it so we can just effectively permanently have a life flask. With enough life flask charge recovery, which is very easy to do by just picking up replenishing remedies and the flask mastery for 1 life flask charge every 3 seconds, we can see that in Path of Building, we'll have a guaranteed 100% uptime on this Divine Flask, assuming we will hit it every 5 seconds. And with that, it effectively means we just get a permanent 1,300 life regen for free. That will never turn off and will immediately start being active the second we take any sort of damage. Now, the nice thing about this is we can actually stack this with some really interesting tech that was figured out by Snap. Now, typically in most builds, you have a free aura that is being turned on through Divine Blessing. The problem with Divine Blessing is that it has a really big multiplier and it only lasts 10 seconds. So you typically have to add in a inspiration and increase duration. And the cost of it will be so high that you'll actually need a decent amount of energy shield to actually be able to turn it on. And without getting yourself a reduced mana cost of skills flask, the ES requirement for you turning this on or the mana requirement will be so high that it's just not really relevant. Well, the nice thing what we could do is we can replace this Divine Blessing with a new support coming out this season called Guardian's Blessing. Guardian's Blessing will make it so whatever minion the support and your aura is linked to, we'll turn that minion into a mini aura bot. And what we're going to do is we're going to link it to a Holy Relic. Now, the Holy Relic is going to take some damage over time from the Guardian's Blessing, which unfortunately is on Path of Building. So this will be a Divine Blessing until Path of Building gets updated, but it is in the notes section and I am mentioning here in the video. But the Holy Relic just has innate built-in life regeneration whenever it triggers the Nova. Now, the way the Nova is procced is when we hit an enemy with attack. Now, how do we attack in a spell build? Well, we will be shield charging around. So assuming we hit an enemy with a shield charge, that will proc the Nova from the Holy Relic, which lasts for a few seconds and giving it really, really strong regeneration, but also proc it on you because the Holy Relic tends to just stick by your side, meaning you also get a little bit of extra regeneration. We can also synergize with our relic even further by putting the Necromancer role on our Life Flask, making 76% of it also apply to our minions, giving our Holy Relic another 1000 permanent life regeneration, meaning this Holy Relic will 1, never die from just casual mapping, and 2, never die from the Guardian's Blessing actively making the Holy Relic die. Meaning we don't have to ever worry about needing to have enough energy shield or enough mana to deal with the Divine Blessing. And because the Holy Relic is a permanent minion, assuming it will never die, which it basically will not, we never have to manually keep recasting the Malevolence every few seconds, making this for a very comfortable playstyle and effectively just giving us another free aura with actually no downside. We actually, funny enough, benefit from this because the Holy Relic just gives us more regen. So with all that combined, on top of all the massive amounts of damage reduction and recovery that we have just have another insane amount of regeneration, making us just an overall Giga Chad and just effectively a massive face tank for everything. And this is only going to get better as we move on to the endgame version of this, where we start having chase items such as Mage Blood, such as Eternal Damnation, and such as being able to fit in a Timeless Jewel for Transcendence, and then us stacking some armor, giving us just even more damage reduction on top of our current existing damage reductions. Next up, I want to start going over the gear. Now, all of the rare gear in here is going to have a crafting guide related to it in the notes section. And alongside this video, I will be releasing a whole crafting video if you want a visual explanation on how to make all these items. Some of these items are very simple to craft. Some of them are a little bit more in depth, but every single one of them has a step-by-step guide that I would really recommend for you to follow if you do want to make these items for yourself. Crafting for this build is actually relatively easy. It's mostly just essence crafting, and it's very, very solo self-found viable outside of potentially the fractured mods, but even these are, I would say, not too bad to attempt to find solo self-found. But if you are someone who likes crafting for yourself, the mid-game version of this build is all about crafting gear, or you just simply buy it if you're not into crafting. Now, some uniques are going to stay, such as Vixens and Leapers, simply because 1, Vixens is unreplaceable. We need this in our build for it to work. And 2, Leapers, even at this price budget, is just simply way too strong to attempt to replace. And any sort of shield that attempts to start beating Leapers on, either in damage or in defenses, is just simply going to cost too much, and it's not going to be worth dropping it. Otherwise, everything else is going to go. So why don't we start with the weapon? So the weapon for this build is going to be a Poison Dagger. Apex is a great weapon, but as we can see, this Poison Dagger is just going to absolutely outclass an Apex. The other nice thing is because it's a Poison Dagger, we can abuse the fact that a Sai has block chance on it to gain additional defensive layer. Now you can make this weapon as either a dagger, a sword, or a claw, but doing this as a dagger and doing this as a Sai is the best option simply because the implicit on the base is the best. We don't care about any sort of attack speed. We don't care about crit chance. We don't care about any of the actual rolls on the weapon other than the fact that it's a dagger base and the fact that it has block chance on it. The way we're going to be crafting this is pretty simple, and it will be detailed in both the notes section and the video that is going to accompany this. But you're basically just going to be looking for a fractured damage multiplier dagger. You can buy this off a trade for a decent price. You're going to be spamming essences to hit 2 rolls. Then you're going to be doing some Veiled Chaos Orb crafting. Next off for the helmet, this helmet's going to be the same thing as the early game helmet, except now we're going to be really focusing on trying to get physical as elemental. And we're going to be making sure we get spell suppression cap. Here, we're going to be looking for some sort of fractured mod to start with. We can either go for fractured spell suppression, or we go for fractured resistance, such as chaos resistance, and then finding spell suppression. But the TLDR here is we're going to be spamming life essences, looking for spell suppression or for resistance if we have fractured spell suppression, and then simply crafting the roll at the end. We really want to make sure we focus on our Eldritch and Blisseds here, and we really want to make sure we get good ones. So we want to probably use Grand Currency to get ourselves Temp Chain's Curse Effect and Duration of Ailments. Both of these rolls are absolutely massive in terms of giving us substantially more damage. And another option, if you want a little bit less damage, is instead of going for the Duration of Ailments, you can go for another physical as elemental roll and make yourself substantially tankier, which is noted in the notes section below. Next up, we have our lightning coil. Now, I will have another separate video on all of this that details how to get yourself a +2 AoE lightning coil for free, but we will want to upgrade from Denibrate over to this. Again, simply because this is just the biggest source of physical as elemental damage in the game. And our whole defensive layer kind of falls apart if we don't have a lightning coil. But we're going to be looking to get a +2 socketed AoE gems lightning coil, because this +2 AoE will apply to our impending doom. And if we want to look at impending doom really quickly, we can see that currently we're 30 million damage. If we go down to level 20 impending doom, we're 26 million. So one additional level on impending doom gave us effectively 4 million extra DPS, making +2 AoE gems really, really strong, not only for your sustain ramped DPS, but also increases your just generic poison DPS, meaning you're going to snap mobs even faster while clearing. So not only is it good for PoE padding poison numbers, but it's also good for insta clearing. Next up, we want to do the same thing that we did for our helmet for our boots. It's going to be the same thing where we're either looking for fractured resistance or fractured spell suppression, spamming a life essence to get the other one, and then crafting some movement speed at the end. Ideally, we would also maybe get a armor roll on here to make our armor a little bit better. And then we want to really focus on the Eldritch and Blitz again. As I mentioned, cooldown recovery rate, every 1% of it is 1% more damage. So we really want to make sure we get as high of a roll as we can. And then we just put action speed on here because action speed is movement speed and attack speed, which is good because both those stats work on shield charge, making us substantially faster. And it's cast speed, which means we will hit our cast speed breakpoints a little bit easier and we get a little bit more DPS out of it. Next up is the jewelry. So the jewelry actually is a little bit finicky and you can do quite a bit with this to make it a little bit better. So the first thing to mention is the 155 strength requirement. Now this can very easily be remedied by just simply getting a lower level shield charge. If we simply get a level 1 shield charge, we can see our strength requirement is only 98 now, making it substantially easier to get this. And you can very easily just find this on a jewel roll somewhere, or you can try and get it as a suffix on one of your cluster jewels and have your attribute requirements be taken care of that way. But if you do want to get yourself a level 20 shield charge, which will make it substantially faster, so you might want to eventually go for 155 strength, we are going to most likely need a strength roll somewhere on our gear. Now, the easiest way to take care of this initially is to just simply use an Eternal Struggle. This is a amulet that has Exarch and Eater of World implicits on it, as well as having a plethora of attribute requirements, some global defenses, and some really nice conditional modifiers. What we would want to do on this Eternal Struggle is we would want to get one that has the Searing Exarch as the dominant role, meaning that its implicit is slightly bigger, because then we get 15% colding, which is really, really strong. As for the implicits on it, there's quite a lot of options that we can get here. And ideally, we want to look for Curse Effect as the strongest one, and we can look for Chaos Damage multi as well on the Eater of Worlds implicit. If you don't want to get Eternal Struggle, or if you have your attributes fixed through your rings, what instead you could do is go for a rare amulet. Now, the rare amulet is going to be substantially stronger, and this will actually be a lot easier to get than a good Eternal Struggle, as a Chaos Dot multi and a Curse Effect Eternal Struggle is going to be ridiculously expensive, but a crafted amulet like this is pretty easy to get. What we're going to do is we're going to get a Fractured Amulet, and then we're simply going to be spamming Envy Essences until we get a good life roll, and then simply just crafting non-channeling at the end. We do need 2 non-channeling rolls somewhere. We can go over this really quickly on how to take care of our mana problems. Now, we're going to have a really high cast speed of Temp Chains, and Temp Chains cost a hell of a lot of mana. And the only way for us to realistically deal with this is to either put it at 0 by running a mana cost flask and 3 non-channeling rolls, or just simply choose to run 2 non-channeling rolls and just leave it at 18, which is not going to be a problem, as 87 ES cost per second is not too bad, and we could deal with that. As you can see, our ES recharge is 85, which is going to completely take care of this, and we'll be able to hold down our Temp Chains button for somewhere around 2 straight minutes before we actually run out of any energy shield. So realistically, we only need 2. So either our amulets or one of our rings is going to be replaced with a unique item instead. But all of this does also need a mana cost flask roll on one of your flasks. So one of the first things I would recommend to do while you are upgrading your build is to immediately get this roll somewhere and then get yourself 2 non-channeling rolls, and then you'll have no mana problems completely. For the rings, what we could do if we want to run a Eternal Struggle is we are going to run 2 Vermilion rings. Now, your other option here is to run 2 Amethyst rings instead, and those will give you more chaos resistance if you want to cap out your chaos resistance. But Vermilion rings are also going to be great for just having substantially more life. These Vermilion rings are very easy to craft. We're just simply going to Hunter Influence them. Then we're going to be spamming them with Envy Essences until we get the increased poison duration damage with poison roll. Then we're just going to simply be multi-modding on non-channeling and life to finish up our rings. We just want to copy paste of this. And if you do need strength, if you are choosing to run a rare amulet that doesn't have any strength on it and you still need more strength, you can instead choose to not put the multi-mod on here and not go for the hunter mod, and instead just Envy Essence the ring until you get a life roll and a strength roll on it, which should be relatively easy to do, and then simply just craft non-channeling at the end, or just simply buy a pre-crafted ring with some life, with some strength on it, and with a open prefix for non-channeling. Now, if we want to run a unique ring instead, what we'd want to go for is a Circle of Nostalgia. This is a synthesis ring that has some Herald of Agony based rolls on it. What we would want to look for is a chaos damage while affected by Herald of Agony roll and a increased buff effect from Herald of Agony. When we combine both these together, this is actually going to give us more damage than one of these rings will provide, but we will not get any sort of non-channeling roll and we'll be losing quite a lot of life. So if you do want a slight amount more damage and a hell of a lot of chaos resistance, you can opt to do this instead of running one of these rare rings instead. And the nice thing about this is, since they are synth rings, they will have a bunch of different synthesis and blisses on it, and you might be able to find some really strong things such as Chaos.multi. Another thing that you could potentially look for if you want a little bit less damage, but if you want to have your chaos resistance completely taken care of for you, is you can instead replace the buff effect or the chaos damage rolls with the chaos resistance roll instead, which gives you chaos resistance while affected by Herald of Agony. This is going to give you quite a lot of chaos resistance for free and should very much help you get all of your chaos resistance. While this is a little bit of fake news, as you don't actually get the 19 chaos res as an implicit, this effectively will get you very close to chaos res cap on its own, making you really, really tanky, as our chaos damage is the only low point in this build, and it's the only thing that we kind of struggle with. Moving on to the belt. Now, the belt is going to be pretty easy to craft. In my opinion, it's a pretty fun craft. What you're going to do is you're going to take a Stygian, and ideally you would find a fractured one, either fractured flask effect as a prefix or fractured life. Then you're going to be spamming life flask recovery essences, which are very good in this case. As you can see, they give us about 300 extra regen until we end up getting tier 1 life. Then we're going to be blocking our prefixes, veil chaos orbing for a suffix, unveiling cooldown recovery rates, and then simply crafting flask effect duration at the end of all of it. It's a very easy craft to do, and it'll be a very powerful craft, and this will be one of the first things I would recommend for you to try and do, as it's very cheap to do as well. And then in the socket, we're just simply going to be putting in some sort of generic jewel. Now, one really interesting stat to consider here is cast speed if you've dealt a crit recently on Abyss Jewels. We have a 5% crit chance, which is not very high, but we're also doing 9 attacks per second, which means that we on average, we'll get a crit every 2 seconds, which means we'll have no problem keeping up the conditional requirement for the cast speed while getting a hell of a lot of increased cast speed from this at the same time. Another option, if you don't want to do this, is you can instead just get a better cast speed roll on your flask, which we'll talk about later, and instead just replace this with another roll. The other good things on here is added spell chaos damage if we're holding a shield, and life. Or you can also look for attributes on here if you need more attributes, or any sort of resistances that you're missing. Moving on next, I want to talk about the passive tree for this and the cluster jewels and all the jewels that are going to go into this. Now we are going to change the passive tree a little bit. We are dropping everything over here on the left and we're dropping Magebane. And instead we're picking up more optimal points that are going to be a little bit better now that we have better gear. So the first thing is going to be quick step, which is going to give us suppress and movement speed, as well as intuition, which is the same thing. It's more suppress and life, making this whole section really, really strong. On top of that, we're going to be more heavily focusing into our flasks, and we're picking up replenishing remedies and careful conservationists, while also going over here and picking up Lethe Shade. And while we're right next to it, we might as well also pick up Growth and Decay. Lethe Shade is going to be a very strong addition to this build, and it's going to make it so any sort of damage over time literally has 0 chance to ever kill you. What Lethe Shade does is for the first 4 seconds of you taking damage over time, it is going to reduce it by 50%. So if you are taking 1,000 chaos damage over time for 4 seconds, if you have a poison applied to you for 4 seconds, Lethe Shade is just going to immediately reduce it by half, before your chaos resistance even applies to it, meaning that any sort of dot damage against you is immediately irrelevant. One place where this is really, really visible, and you can see the power of Lethe Shade, is Uber Cyrus. All of the little dots on the ground that Uber Cyrus puts throughout the fight completely stop any of your regeneration from working and do a stupid amount of damage over time to you. If you go do that fight with and without Lethe Shade, and if you are a Uber Cyrus farmer, you know how much of a difference this makes. And it's basically the difference between making the boss annoying to do and making the boss an absolute breeze. Lethe Shade is just way too strong, and it's good in basically every scenario, and it's always a must pick. And because of that, we could also just pick up Growth and Decay, as I said, which is right next to it, for a very massive damage increase. Otherwise, the tree is going to look exactly the same. And the only other change is going to be the cluster jewels. Now, this cluster jewel is going to be the exact same cluster jewel as the starting path of building, except now we're going to always go for 8 passive skills. But you can choose to cheap out and go for a 9 or a 10 passive skill instead. And you can again choose to cheap out even further by dropping potentially Wicked Pall or Unwaveringly Evil or Unholy Grace. But it's kind of hard to do that because all 3 of these nodes are amazing. Unwaveringly Evil is required if you go Bloodnotch. Wicked Pall is great because the skill effect duration, making both your withers longer and your poisons longer. And Unholy Grace is just great because there's so much damage because of the cast speed on it, while also giving you generic attack speed, making your shield charge even better. Next up for the medium jewels, our one medium jewel over here is going to be the same thing as before. It's going to be a chaos damage over time cluster. And we need to have septic cells on this no matter what, as otherwise we cannot get 100% chance to poison. And then for our second roll, we are either going to get Circling Oblivion, which is the best damage node, or we can look for one of the regen or one of the life nodes, such as Flow of Life. As for our other cluster, we are now going to be getting ourselves a Flask effect duration cluster. Now, the reason we need this is because we need to absolutely make sure we have 100% uptime on all of our flasks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And if we don't have 100% uptime on our flasks, we are going to be losing a massive portion of our defensive layer. So because of that, we need to run a spike concoction, which is just going to be absolutely disgusting. Not only does it again give us attack speed for shield charge, and it gives us cast speed to hit our breakpoints a little bit easier, but it gives us Alchemist Genius when we have a flask active, which is always going to be true. Alchemist Genius gives us 20% increased flash charges gained, which helps massively with keeping our flasks up, but also gives us 10% increased effective flask, which is a very, very strong stat. And it's going to give us 1, a lot more regeneration, and 2, a lot more tankiness. To bundle this, we're also going to be running a Brood for potency. Now, there's quite a lot of notables that you can run on a flask effect duration node instead, but I personally like Brood for potency a little bit more than anything else because it gives you flash charges gained, which we need. It gives you increased damage over time, which is a DPS increase, and it gives you a massive amount of extra life recovery from flasks, meaning we get a stupid amount of regeneration and a large amount of damage just from this one node. Both of these clusters should be relatively cheap to get. Crafting flask effect duration clusters are not very difficult, and you could technically craft this yourself. But the only expensive thing here is going to really be the large cluster, which is going to be, I would say, very expensive. So I would immediately probably just try to look for a 9 or a 10 passive one instead. Lastly, the final thing to mention about this whole build is going to be the flasks. Now, the flasks are going to be a massive, massive portion of the build, as I've said throughout this whole guide. We really want to make sure we focus on getting good rolls on all these, as you can treat these as item slots effectively with them being up permanently. It's the same thing as if you had a Mage Blood. You want to make sure you have perfect best in slot flasks because those flasks are always active and they give you quite a lot of your stats. What we're going to be doing for our flasks is we're going to always be running a life flask. As I mentioned, we want to run the life recovery to minions for the Holy Relic tech. And then for the prefix, we just want to have the increased amount recovery, reduced recovery rate, as it's going to increase our regeneration by the most. Now, there's quite a few prefixes you can put on here, and you can feel free to move this around however you please. But personally, if you want the highest regeneration flask, this is what I would go for. Another thing to mention is I would highly recommend to get this to 28 quality by going and getting yourself a Betrayal Benchcraft on it. As we can see, if we go over and edit it really quickly, making it 28% quality would give us an additional 80 life regen, which is really nice to have. And this is pretty cheap to do. As for our other flasks, we have a few options. Now, what I would really recommend for everyone is to run the 3 elemental flasks, a sapphire flask, a ruby flask, and a topaz flask. These are going to be mandatory because they're going to reduce all of the physical damage taken as elemental that we're going to be stacking our build. And they're going to double dip with spell suppression to make it so any sort of spells that go against you literally just do 0 damage, while also completely taking care of all of our resistances. If you've taken a look at any of this gear as I've shown it, it doesn't really have many resistances on it. And the reason behind that is these 3 flasks will completely take care of most of the resistances for you for free. The last flask slot that we have, I would ideally pick up a Onslaught flask. Onslaught is going to be just as good as Quicksilver. It's not going to give you the movement speed of a Quicksilver, but when we are going to be shield charging around most of the time, it's literally just as strong as it. Onslaught gives us attack speed, cast speed, and movement speed. And we combine both the attack speed and the movement speed together with shield charge, it's actually the same thing as if we had a Quicksilver active. And then the added benefit of all this is we also get the cast speed, which means we can reach our cast speed cap a little bit easier. Now, one thing that we could do instead is on the suffixes, we can get a much stronger cast speed roll. On this flask, we have a really, really weak one. But what we could do is we can instead get ourselves a really, really high cast speed roll and then forego the cast speed on our jewels, or even be able to drop some other cast speed in the rest of our tree to be able to not need as much and have less pressure on the rest of our gear. The roll of this is simply just going to be determined by how much cast speed you actually need in your build. And I can't really tell you the exact number here, as you're going to have different amounts of cast speed on your gear. So you can either choose to just get a max roll here and then get less cast speed on the rest of your gear, or you just simply choose to go for a bottom roll here and then use your flask as a way to tailor it to the exact amount of cast speed you need. The other thing to mention is the one unique flask that we want to run for now is going to be Taste of Hate. Taste of Hate is going to be really strong early on until we can fit in a Forbidden Shackle and a Dawnbreaker, because this is going to give us 15% physical damage from hits converted to cold, while also being a Sapphire Flask at the same time. Now, you can forego to run this and instead just run a normal Sapphire Flask to then get another suffix. But in my opinion, I don't really think that's worth it. And I feel like running a Taste of Hate is just better, just because there really aren't any other suffixes that we really need. Yes, you could fit in things such as Curse Immunity, but honestly, in my opinion, I don't really feel like curses are really that big of a deal. And we actually have a little bit of reduced curse effect on us through Steep and Profane. And honestly, this 15% reduced effect is probably more than enough to really make most of the curses not really matter that much. And in my opinion, I feel like Curse Immunity is not really that needed unless you're playing hardcore, for example. But on our other 2 flasks, on the Ruby and on the Topaz flask, we want to make sure we have the reduced duration increase effect prefix, as the uptime of these is going to be so high that we can reduce their duration and still have 100% uptime while just making them even stronger. But on our silver flask, we're going to need to run increased charge recovery because we simply cannot have 100% uptime on a silver flask. What I'd recommend here to do is to also look for a 28% quality silver flask, because currently, as you can see, this is an 80% uptime. And if we were to 28% quality this, we can see that it goes up to 86% quality, which is realistically the best you're going to get before you get a Mage Blood to where you'll have 100% uptime. As for the suffixes that we want on our 3 flasks, ideally, we want to get a movement speed roll somewhere. We are going to need a cast speed roll somewhere. Unless you have so much cast speed that you don't need this, then you could fit in Curse Immunity. And then we're going to, very importantly, need the reduced mana cost of skills effect roll on here, as this is going to make it so we actually can deal with the mana problems of Temp Chains. I would really recommend to just immediately go and try and buy this from someone as soon as you can at the start of the season. This is one of the most important items and one of the most important upgrades for your build. And when you are getting this roll from someone, try to make sure to get them to craft it to a max roll, as the difference between 20 and 25% is pretty massive. The last thing that we should talk about in this whole guide is going to be the 2 unique jewels in this build. So we will have a Balance of Terror and a Watcher's Eye. Now, the Watcher's Eye is going to be a crucial part of converting all of our physical over to elemental. And while we do that, we can also get ourselves a increased damage mod through the damage over time multiplier while affected by Malevolence. This is ideally the best 2-statted Watcher's Eye you can go for. But if instead you want a more tankier option, what you can do is you can forego the Malevolence roll and instead go for 2 Purity of Element rolls. Here we have a Purity of Elements, physical as cold, but any of them work. The physical as fire and the physical as lightning are also good. And you could stack 2 of them together. So for example, you can get a physical as cold and a physical as lightning Watcher's Eye together. And that would make it so you have even more conversion. But the thing is, those are rare and those are very expensive. But if you do see one for cheap, I would go and immediately snag one, as it would make you substantially tankier. And I would probably forego the 7% damage from the damage multiplier any day for 100% conversion for free through a Watcher's Eye. The other one is going to be Balance of Terror. Now, this is going to be a new jewel that is going to come back into the game from Sanctum. This previously is what made Impending Doom silly broken, and it's honestly going to make it super broken here again. The special thing about this is it's effectively a Watcher's Eye, but for curses. If we want to quickly look at it, it has a bunch of roles for every single different type of curse. And the one we're looking for here is the cooldown recovery rate when we cast Temp Chains. Now, before you get Balance of Terror, do not run Temporal Chains as your main 6-link. This will actually make you lose damage. You want to instead run a Enfeeble in your 6-link, and you want Temp Chains to be in your Vixens. But as soon as you get this, you want to swap them around, because this cooldown recovery rate, if you cast Temp Chains the past 10 seconds, only counts if you've manually casted it. Triggering it from Vixens will not count. So don't get baited by any of the other pretty mods on here and be like, oh, I can get one with this as well. No, it will not work. It will not do anything because you will not be manually casting it. Ideally, all you want to get on early is going to be a cooldown recovery rate one, because these are going to be expensive. I can almost guarantee you that the rarity of these is going to be adjusted and they're going to be substantially rare. And because Impending Doom is going to be pretty sought after as a build this season, this is going to be a pretty in-demand item. And we're only going to be able to just find the cheapest one with the lowest cooldown recovery rate for any sort of reasonable price. That's okay, because what we could do is we could just take this and we just divide it all the way up until we get to 25. It's most likely going to be cheaper than trying to buy a Max World one, as I expect these jewels to probably be worth like 10, 15 div for at least the first week of the season. So throwing 1 or 2 divine at it when it's a roll from 20 to 25 really isn't asking for too much. The other really good roll on here is the Temporal Chains Action Speed roll. This is one of the most insane possible mods you can get anywhere. Action speed cannot be slowed below base value if you cast Temporal Chains at past 10 seconds. This is literally the same exact thing as Juggernaut Unstoppable. This means that while this is not necessarily that useful against chills because we'll be chill immune, this is extremely useful if you want to do any sort of delirium content, because the pools on the ground in delirium that reduce your action speed and the debuff that gets applied to you that reduces your action speed effectively gets completely nullified by this roll, and you will never have to worry about any sort of random slow. This also makes you immune to any arch nemesis temporal bubble enemies, and it makes it so you don't actually care that you stay in the bubble. This is such a unique stat that is very difficult to find items. It's such a premium that I would happily buy this as an endgame min-max just to make my build feel substantially better. And that's all there really is to talk about in this. As I mentioned, the notes section will basically have everything I just mentioned all over again. And at the bottom of it, if you want some sort of idea in terms of how would you actually buy these items or what order I would recommend for you to buy these items in, there will be an upgrade path at the bottom that you can try to loosely follow. And it's going to be in order of important upgrades, in my opinion, / the order in which things will be cheap. And it should provide you with at least some resemblance of a path on how to get from the early game guide all the way to the mid-end guide. Other than that, if you have any other questions, please feel free to leave in the comments below. I also stream every day on Twitch, so if you have any questions, feel free to come by there and ask for yourself. I can't wait to play this build on Leaguestar, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think a lot of people are going to have fun with it, especially with how tanky it is and how comfy it is to play. It's going to have no problem tearing through all content, and it should be a really, really fun time to play. That's all I really have for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you kitties in the next one.